Good morning. Subcommittee will come to order. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Pacific Northwest Seismic Hazards, Planning and Preparing for the Next Disaster. The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA's, role in earthquake hazard preparedness, mitigation, response, and recovery. We're also going to speak with some of the world's leaders in seismology and earthquake. I want to thank Ranking Member DeFazio for his leadership on this critical national issue. He has been an advocate for his state and the Pacific Northwest, supporting preparedness and mitigation efforts and the development of a public West Coast earthquake early warning system. Just last week, we saw the second devastating earthquake strike Nepal. Our thoughts and prayers go out to those impacted and the thousands that are working to help. We know earthquakes pose one of the greatest natural hazards here in the United States. They strike without warning and result in potentially catastrophic casualties and damage to buildings and infrastructure. Portions of all 50 states in the District of Columbia are vulnerable to earthquake hazards. Earthquakes cannot be prevented, but their impacts on life, property, and the economy can be managed. FEMA is responsible for coordinating the federal response to a catastrophic earthquake and has been diligently working to help states plan and prepare for the inevitability of an earthquake. FEMA has a robust national exercise program that in recent years has tested state and regional earthquake response plans in Alaska, in the South and Midwest along the New Madrid Seismic Zone, and just last week in California. We know that FEMA's national urban search and rescue teams are key assets in the wake of disasters like earthquakes. This Congress, H.R. 1471, the FEMA Disaster Assistance Reform Act of 2015, which was voted out of committee in April, reauthorizes the USER program and provides key protections to the individuals who serve on those teams. We also will hear from Dr. Ashford about the earthquake threat in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest and the efforts the state has led to bring together all members of the community to strengthen communities. While we are not able to predict earthquakes, I was excited to learn that Dr. Allen and his colleagues are working with the federal government to develop an earthquake early warning system. Finally, Mr. Hooper has been leading efforts to update model building codes to include the latest engineering and building science to minimize earthquake impacts on buildings. There are lessons to be learned from the efforts of leaders in the Pacific Northwest that should drive the way we plan for and mitigate against disasters. I look forward to hearing from the witnesses and thank them all for being here today. I now call on Ranking Member of the Subcommittee, Mr. Carson, for a brief opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Costello. I want to acknowledge the Ranking Member, Mr. Peter DeFazio. My good friend Al Beal is here as well. Good morning. I join in welcoming today's witnesses for this important hearing. When someone hears earthquake, they immediately think of the West Coast. But there are actually 42 states at significant risk for a quake. Indiana, the great Hoosier state, is one of them. 2 major fault zones run in or near southwestern Indiana, the Wabash Valley Seismic Zone and the New Madrid Zone as well. In the past, the New Madrid fault has produced magnitude 7 to 8 earthquakes. If a 7.7 quake from the New Madrid fault was to occur today, the Mid-America Earthquake Center estimates that it would damage 14,000 buildings, resulting in 2,000 deaths and cause $12 billion in direct economic loss in Indiana alone. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, plays an important role in helping the nation address earthquake risks. I appreciate that the 2011 national level exercise tested earthquake plans in the New Madrid zone. Indiana had many participants and learned a great deal, including the need to address urban search and rescue issues beforehand. As a result of this exercise, communication has increased among the states affected by the New Madrid fault. Last year, several public and private agencies in Indiana participated in the Central United States Earthquake Consortium Multi-State Capstone 14 exercise. That exercise assessed national and regional response and recovery capabilities after a quake on the New Madrid zone. Building on the 2011 exercise, the Hoosier State focused on housing recovery support functions to address post-disaster housing issues and to facilitate delivery of resources to local governments for reconstruction. This exercise provides valuable insight into what works and what needs improvement. FEMA has statutory duties under the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Act, or NEHRP, and I'd like to see this subcommittee take a really more active role in the reauthorization of this program. We need to ensure that FEMA is fulfilling its mission and has adequate authority and funding levels to perform its duties. The GAO has identified no-notice catastrophic events such as earthquakes as one of the greatest emergency management challenges that FEMA faces. We cannot ignore this issue. And finally, I would be remiss to not recognize and commend the urban search and rescue teams that are assisting in the aftermath of the 2 recent Nepal quakes. Their training and skills are being put to effective use. Once again, they are putting their lives at risk to help others around the world. This is a perfect example of why Congress needs to ensure the teams have the protection and benefits they deserve. Congress needs to move forward quickly on H.R. 1471, the FEMA Disaster Assistance Reform Act of 2015, which was recently reported from this committee. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Carson. I now call on the Ranking Member of the full committee, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your bringing attention to this. I'd observe, unfortunately, here in Washington, D.C., we seem to have what I call a tombstone mentality, which is if this were the day after the Cascadia subduction fault or a big earthquake on New Madrid, the room would be packed, press would be out in the hallways, and we'd have lines waiting. But the sad fact is that if we are better prepared, if we invest in resilience, if we invest in the case of the West Coast in an early warning system, we can save potentially thousands of lives and billions of dollars in infrastructure and economic damages and losses. The Cascadia earthquake is, basically it is inevitable. The question is when, and what will we do to prepare for it before then? I did get a minor provision in H.R. 1471 that would encourage states to use hazard mitigation in support of building capability for earthquake warning, except unfortunately FEMA is underinvesting in that program. For the Pacific Northwest, Oregon, Washington at risk, and Northern California for $38 million, the government of the United States of America could fund a real-time, at-sea-based early warning system, which would give people halfway up the coast a couple of minutes to get out of inundation zones. It would give people in Portland maybe 7 minutes to shut down the metro, get people off the bridges, shut down manufacturing processes, et cetera. Over in the valley, we'd have 5 to 7 minutes to evacuate schools made out of bricks that are going to fall down and kill the kids. But we don't have that because we're the United States of America and we can't afford $38 million to save thousands of lives. And then everybody would point fingers the day after the quake and say, why didn't we do that just like with Amtrak? We can and we should. And so I'm really pleased you're holding this hearing here today. I want to particularly thank Dr. Scott Ashford, Dean of Oregon State's University College of Engineering. He's worked very closely with the state of Oregon on an earthquake resilience plan. We're really at the beginning stages. Our legislature is deciding whether to commit more and how much state money to that sort of pre-disaster investment, and he has played a very key role in that. With that, I look forward to hearing from the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Oh, I would like to put my entire statement, which is long and very thoughtful and more detailed, in the record, without objection.
Without objection. Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. We will have a single panel of witnesses today. We have Mr. Robert J. Fenton, Deputy Associate Administrator for Response and Recovery at FEMA, Dr. Scott A. Ashford, Dean of the College of Engineering at Oregon State University, Dr. Richard M. Allen, Director of the Berkeley Seismological Laboratory at UC Berkeley, and Mr. John Hooper, the Director of Earthquake Engineering at MKA, representing the American Society of Civil Engineers. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record. Without objection, so ordered. Since your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your oral testimony to 5 minutes. Mr. Fenton, you may proceed.
Vice Chairman Costello, Ranking Member Carson, and members of the distinguished subcommittee. As a fifth-generation San Franciscan who has served 13 years for FEMA Region 9's Oakland office in California and soon will be reporting as its regional administrator, I understand the significant threats that catastrophic earthquakes pose our nation. We have seen in recent weeks the devastating consequences of both the 7.3, 7.8 magnitude earthquakes that struck Nepal, and our thoughts continue to be with the survivors. Catastrophic earthquakes of that magnitude in an urban area in the United States would impact millions of people and cause profound social and economic impacts. That's why it is vitally important that the federal government maintain a forward-leaning posture and be ready to act decisively at the direction of the President to effectively support state, local, tribal, territorial governments in saving lives and protecting property. I appreciate the opportunity today to update you on FEMA and our whole community partners' efforts to improve our nation's preparedness for earthquake threats and to maintain our readiness to respond. Over the past 4 years and at the direction of the President, FEMA and our partners have worked to develop and implement the National Preparedness System, which includes a national planning framework for each of the 5 mission areas: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, and recovery. These frameworks identify how the whole community will build and deliver the core capabilities required to address the threats that pose the greatest risks to our nation. In support of the National Response and Recovery Frameworks, we recently developed federal interagency operational plans, which are all hazards plans based on a maximum scenario that includes catastrophic incidents and cascading impacts, including a major earthquake. In addition to the federal interagency operational plans, FEMA has developed 5 national-level incident annexes, one of which is focused at earthquakes. In addition to that, we've recently facilitated the development of all hazard plans in each of our 10 regions and have developed 31 regional incident annexes, one of which I'm holding today is the one for Cascadia Subduction Zone in the Pacific Northwest. Recognizing this, FEMA, in coordination with our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners, are constantly seeking ways to improve our ability to address potential threats and risks associated with catastrophic events such as earthquakes. Through our National Exercise Program, the whole community continues to test, improve, and assess national preparedness across the whole Homeland Security enterprise. This year, FEMA participated in the Southern California earthquake exercise involving a magnitude 7.8 earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. FEMA, in conjunction with our partners, are analyzing our results of the exercise and will integrate lessons learned into our plans, doctrine, and operations as required. In addition to the planning and exercising that FEMA supports with our whole community partners, I also want to highlight our efforts in improving individual preparedness for earthquakes. In 2013, FEMA and our partners unveiled the America's Preparathon, a nationwide community-based campaign for action to increase emergency preparedness and resilience. A major activity of the America's Preparathon is the Great Shakeout, an exercise whereby millions of people participate in earthquake drills. We continue to see increasing levels of participation in the Great Shakeout. I'd also like to highlight that FEMA has made significant strides in alert and warning systems through our integrated public alert and warning system for all hazards called IPAWS. Early detection for earthquakes can be difficult. However, I'm encouraged by our state partners that are actively installing sensors in the ground to warn of earthquake activities as early as possible. In conclusion, FEMA is one part of the whole community effort that is required to effectively prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. The response to a major earthquake along one of our nation's fault lines will require resources from across all levels of government, private sector, and non-governmental organizations in the public. These are the scenarios that we are planning and exercising against, and we are adapting the way we do business based on these lessons learned. As outlined in our administrators and our agency's 2014 through 2018 strategic plan, we are focusing on strategic priorities, including becoming an expeditionary organization and posturing and building capability for catastrophic disasters. That will help to institutionalize key improvements while building capacity and strengthening national capabilities for disaster preparedness. I look forward to working with you, distinguished members of this subcommittee, and other members of Congress to continue these important efforts. I'm prepared to answer any questions the subcommittee have. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Fenton. Dr. Ashford, you may proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. My name is Scott Ashford. I'm Dean of the College of Engineering at Oregon State University. I'm pleased to be before you today testifying on my role as chair of our Governor's Task Force on Resilience Plan Implementation. As chair, I was responsible for advancing Oregon on a path towards resilience in face of the upcoming megaquake along the Cascadia Subduction Zone, perhaps the greatest impending natural disaster to face the United States. I have seen firsthand communities destroyed by earthquakes. Most recently in Japan, I saw the devastation left by the 2011 9.0 subduction zone earthquake and tsunami that killed over 15,000 people and wiped entire communities off the map. This is a mirror image of what we expect in the Pacific Northwest. The Cascadia subduction zone extends from Northern California to British Columbia, where a 9.0 magnitude earthquake felt from Salt Lake to San Francisco will shake 3 to 5 minutes, and a tsunami will inundate much of the coastline, killing thousands. The last major Cascadia event occurred in the year 1700, and we are now due. The biggest challenge for Oregon is our legacy infrastructure, vulnerable buildings, bridges, and pipelines that were built before anyone knew that the Cascadia was active. This problem is not unique. States in the New Madrid Fault Zone, like Indiana, Arkansas, and Kentucky, are also seismically vulnerable because of their legacy infrastructure. Oregon leaders recognized the need to prepare for the eventual likelihood of a Cascadia event and called for the Oregon Resilience Plan. Our vision is that 50 years from now, our businesses and communities will have the resilience to bounce back from this megaquake. The 300-page report completed in 2013 contains over 140 different recommendations, and frankly, it was difficult to figure out where to start. To find a path forward, the legislature formed the Governor's Task Force on Resilience Plan Implementation, which I chaired. Our specific recommendations were submitted to the legislature last September in a 2-page report, which I have submitted as part of my testimony. Based on our report, 4 bills now sit in our state's Senate Ways and Means Committee waiting for action. Today, I would like to focus on our recommendations in just 3 areas where the federal government plays a key role in working in partnership with states and private enterprise. In transportation, mobility is critical to rescue, relief, and recovery efforts following a natural disaster, and for the economy to start moving so that people can get back to work. Our state knows what we need to do, but the price tag for the seismic retrofit program in Oregon is over $5 billion. The first phase alone, to strengthen our bridges and prevent landslides, just key lifeline routes, is $1 billion. This is definitely an area where enhanced state-federal partnership is needed, where the state is stuck with a plan but really no money to act. Around liquid fuels, 90% of all liquid fuel used in Oregon comes into one single location, extremely vulnerable to damage in an earthquake. But due to the interstate nature of liquid fuel transmission, Oregon has no regulatory authority to act. This is another area where the federal government can work with affected states to require seismic resilience of federally regulated utilities. And finally, in research, with the unique combination of a 9.0 earthquake and the legacy infrastructure, applied research is a way that we can assure that precious taxpayer dollars are used in the most value and cost-informed manner possible. Businesses already understand this. Companies like Portland General Electric and the Northwest Natural Gas have joined the BPA, the Port of Portland, and ODOT to form the Cascadia Lifelines program at Oregon State University. These lifeline providers pool and direct their research dollars in a consortium aimed at finding solutions to the seismic challenges that they jointly face. Key legislative opportunities in the Congress that can facilitate effective public-private partnerships for applied research include the Highway Bill with university transportation centers, the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, and seismic research funded by FEMA, NIST, NSF, the USGS, and the FHWA. In closing, the Cascadia subduction zone is estimated to be the single greatest natural threat facing the United States. Oregon is taking steps on its own to mitigate this threat. Other West Coast states and those in the New Madrid Fault Zone can follow our example. It will take decades and significant resources to improve our resilience. But we need to start now, and we need to all work together collaboratively across governments, academia, and the private sector. The federal government is a critical partner in our ability as a state, a region, and a country to effectively prepare for this impending natural disaster. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee, for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I stand ready to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you for your testimony, Dr. Ashford. Dr. Allen, you may proceed.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. The Pacific Northwest must be ready for a magnitude 9 earthquake. Recent magnitude 9 events around the world include the 2011 Tohoku-oki earthquake in Japan and the 2004 Sumatra earthquake. These were responsible for tens and hundreds of thousands of lives lost. The last magnitude 9 in the Pacific Northwest was just over 300 years ago, and we are now in the period when we should expect the next megathrust earthquake. My name is Rich Dowell, and I'm the director of the UC Berkeley Seismological Laboratory and a professor of Earth and Planetary Science. I'm also one of the architects of the Shake Alert Earthquake Early Warning System, a new technology that we hope to roll out along the US West Coast to reduce the impacts of the next big earthquake. We would very much like to build this warning system before the next earthquake occurs, but to do that will require action from this legislature. The Shake Alert Earthquake Early Warning Project is a collaboration between the University of Washington, the University of Oregon, the University of California, Berkeley, the California Institute of Technology, the U.S. Geologic Survey, and several state agencies. We are now operating a demonstration earthquake early warning system that issues alerts to a group of test users for events throughout Washington, Oregon, and California. So what is earthquake early warning? By using networks of geophysical sensors distributed across the West Coast, we can rapidly detect the beginnings of an earthquake. Shake Alert then estimates the size of the event and predicts the shaking intensity that will follow. The warning time depends on the distance from the initiation point. In the case of the Pacific Northwest, if a magnitude 9 starts at the southern end of the Cascadia subduction zone, as research suggests, Portland could receive 3 minutes of warning and Seattle as much as 5 minutes. There are many things that can be done to reduce the impacts of earthquakes with a few minutes of warning. One of my colleagues, Professor Doug Toomey at the University of Oregon, asked one of his local elementary school principals how long it would take to evacuate his 350-student school, built in 1926. His answer, 1.5 minutes. This is just one of 1,000 schools that a recent Oregon State survey concluded would collapse in a magnitude 9 earthquake. Studies of injuries caused by the 1994 Northridge earthquake show that more than 50% were caused by falling hazards, bookcases, ceiling tiles, lighting fixtures, etc. If everyone gets a warning, and if everyone drops, takes cover, and holds on, then we could reduce the number of earthquake injuries by 50%. Other applications of earthquake early warning include automated responsive transportation systems, isolation of hazardous machinery and chemicals, opening elevator doors at the nearest floors to stop people from being trapped, and alerting surgeons to remove the scalpel from inside a patient. The existing West Coast Shake Alert demonstration system has proven the capabilities of this technology. In the recent magnitude 6 earthquake in Napa, California, Shake Alert issued a warning across the San Francisco Bay Area. Although this is only a demonstration system, it is of such value to the BART train system in the region that they have already implemented an automated train stopping system. It takes BART just 24 seconds to bring a full-speed train to a stop, thereby reducing the likelihood of derailment. During peak hours at any point in time, there are between 40 and 45 trains running at full speed, each carrying 1,000 passengers. Earthquake early warning is not a panacea for the earthquake problem in the Pacific Northwest. It will not prevent buildings from collapsing, and we must continue to make progress improving our buildings so that it will not collapse, as Dr. Ashford was just discussing. At the same time, Shake Alert provides a new opportunity to reduce the impact of coming quakes. So what will it take to build an earthquake early warning system for the U.S. West Coast? The U.S. Geologic Survey is the federal agency with the responsibility for issuing alerts, but there's a critical role for the private sector. Their expertise is needed to distribute the alerts broadly through cell phones, internet providers, TV, and radio. Building a public warning system will also create new business opportunities to provide specialized alerts for specific users and the development of automated control systems. Building this system is not expensive. The U.S. Geologic Survey has developed an implementation plan for the U.S. West Coast. This system could be operational in 2 years if the necessary funding is made available. The cost for operating the system would be $6.5 million per year above what's currently spent. Last year, Congress appropriated $5 million to begin the process of transitioning from the current demonstration system to a full-blown public system. Thank you for that. The U.S. Geologic Survey and West Coast universities are now using those resources to improve the geophysical network infrastructure to make the current system faster and more robust. This is a great first step, but the full implementation plan needs to be funded. In closing, the earthquake threat along the U.S. West Coast increases every day as the strain on the faults builds. It is not if, But when will the next earthquake strike? And we are due for an earthquake in multiple locations. Earthquake early warning is a new and important tool to have in our disaster preparedness kit. Japan has a warning system, Mexico has a warning system, China, Taiwan, Turkey, and Romania have systems. If there was an earthquake today, I believe we would build this warning system tomorrow. Let's not miss this opportunity, and let's get Shake Alert funded today. Thank you.
Dr. Allen, thank you. Mr. Hooper, please proceed.
Yeah. Vice Chairman Costello and distinguished members of the subcommittee, I am John Hooper, a senior principal and director of earthquake engineering with MKA in Seattle. On behalf of the American Society of Civil Engineers, it is my pleasure to provide this testimony. In addition to designing building structures throughout the country, I have also participated in building code development and earthquake engineering research for over 3 decades. I have served in various capacities for these efforts and am currently the chair of the American Society of Civil Engineers Seismic Subcommittee. This subcommittee is tasked with developing the seismic requirements for the vast majority of jurisdictions throughout the United States. Jurisdictions adopt these seismic requirements by voluntarily adopting the International Building Code, or IBC, a comprehensive code that provides requirements for building design and performance. The majority of state and jurisdictions also adopt the IBC. The IBC then references ASE 7, minimum design loads for buildings and other structures, for the design requirements for most natural hazards, including seismic. A major contribution to the evolution of seismic design, however, was the development of the NEHRP's seismic provisions for seismic regulations for new and other structures, originally published in 1985. These seismic design guidelines were developed with the leadership and support from FEMA. These NEHRP provisions have been continually updated since that first version, and with the next version due out at the end of this year. The provisions also serve as a resource document to the seismic design requirements currently found in ASE 7, a collaboration that has been in existence for over 20 years. The potential of a cascaded subduction zone was not really fully understood until USGS research occurred in the late 1980s and was presented to the structural engineering community in the Pacific Northwest. Based on this research, the seismic zone maps in the 1994 UBC were modified to include the effects of the cascaded subduction zone for the first time. So buildings up to that point did not include that seismic hazard in the design of those structures. Policymakers, emergency planners, and engineers in the Northwest are very aware of the shaking that can result from Cascadia. Due to continued publicity regarding new research that's published in the newspapers throughout the Northwest, the public is fairly clear about the shaking that could occur, but not what the performance of buildings is really going to be like. They're not really aware of what we design to. So a quick summary of what performance goals we achieve or try to achieve. Given a rare event, we are out there to protect life. And doing so, we may not necessarily achieve economically feasible repairs to a building in that case. For critical buildings like hospitals and fire stations, et cetera, we achieve a higher performance. This with the intent that these facilities will experience damage, but will be functional following rare earthquake ground shaking. To provide more resilient designs, though, we need a change required in these seismic performance goals. This change will come with increased construction costs, however. Some federal, state, and local jurisdictions have provided or are considering providing enhanced performance for some of their projects. Some large companies would be financially affected by extended shutdowns have already done so. Typically, though, private owners and developers are generally unaware of what the building code gives them, and the few that do would use enhanced performance designs if they could have a reasonable return on their investment. Changing the design approach for an entire community to increase resiliency will be a challenge. First, the turnover of building stock in a typical community is low, so enhancing the performance of existing buildings will require seismic upgrading. However, it is not necessary that all buildings achieve enhanced performance to achieve a resilient community. Careful planning is needed to determine which buildings and facilities should be subject to enhanced seismic design or seismic upgrading. Second, and equally important, for a community to be resilient, the remainder of the community's lifelines must also be seismically designed or upgraded to an enhanced level as well. Finally, to achieve a resilient community, the key element is to fund these capital costs, regardless of these challenges, through policymaker leadership, careful community planning, the beginnings of resilient communities can and increasingly will be achieved. As previously mentioned, NEHRP has made significant contributions. NEHRP makes Americans safer and our nation more secure, resilient, and financially stronger through research in the earth sciences, public policy, and engineering. ASCE and I urge you to work with the Science, Space, and Technology Committee to reauthorize this vital program. Thank you for the opportunity to share my views. I'm able to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Hooper. I will now begin the first round of questions, limited to 5 minutes for each member. If there are additional questions following the first round, we will have additional rounds of questions as needed. Given Ranking Member DeFazio's strong interest and leadership on this issue, I'd like to yield my time for questions to him. Mr. DeFazio, you are recognized for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's very generous of you. First, to FEMA, I note that the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program gets $7.8 million of funding. Given what you just heard today, don't you believe that we should perhaps be investing more money in that program to deal with both early warning and other things that have just been talked about in terms of mitigation?
Sir, and the NEHRP program is one program among many programs and resources we have to provide to assist in this issue. I went over a number of them in my opening. The planning that we provide millions of dollars in planning each year. We've requested money for pre-disaster mitigation this year. There's post-disaster mitigation. So all those together provide a significant number of resources. I think we need to continue to look at the issue and continue to work with them, our partners across this table, to
right.
See what
now, the early warning issue, I mean, I'm looking at giving you specific authorization since it hasn't been given a priority. Why hasn't it been given a priority? I mean, you just heard here we can save thousands of lives, potentially mitigate billions of dollars, well, at least a lot of damage in terms of shutting down systems, et cetera, with warning.
Yeah, sir, we are looking into early warning systems. As you know, we've done it, had early warning systems for years now.
Okay, all right, thanks. Okay, that's good. We want to do more than look into them. Dr. Ashford, I guess first I'll go to Dr. Allen. You talked about the system, 38 million land-based. Would there be any advantage to having something that was based in the ocean? The Japanese have put sensors in the ocean. Does that give you more time?
Absolutely, it gives you more time. I didn't talk about it because the piece I focused on is the onshore piece. So it's $16 million per year to run, plus $38 million capital investment to have it running in 2 years. We have an implementation. We, the USGS, the West Coast universities, have an implementation plan for that. It's a proven technology. So that's what we would like to do first. But in addition to that, exactly as you say, if we were to put out additional sensors on the end of a cable, particularly in the Cascadia subduction zone, that would get us more sensors closer to the fault, and that would simply give us more warning time.
Okay. Thanks. And then, Dr. Ashford, the work you've done, the $1 billion just for key lifeline routes in the little state of Oregon, that's because of bridge collapse and other maybe landslides, I guess?
Yeah, that is just the backbone route, actually east of the Cascades and down through part of the Willamette Valley, and that is for strengthening bridges and trying to mitigate the landslides.
So what you're thinking is the east side of the Cascades will be less impacted, and then you would run lifeline routes down through the Cascades down to where all the people live.
That's right, but even with that, all of the routes to the coast would be shut down from bridge failure and landslides, and all of U.S. Highway 101 would also be shut down.
Okay, that's a bit sobering. Give me that list again of countries that have early warning systems. I think you said Japan, China, Taiwan, Romania.
That's right, Mexico and Taiwan.
Mexico, yeah. I saw a very dramatic, actually, illustration of Mexico, which gives you the idea. I mean, the fault, I guess, is quite close to Mexico City, but it was in a TV station. Guy's broadcasting the news. He suddenly starts talking very quickly. My Spanish isn't that good, but I get the idea something's going on, and he talks for a full minute before things start falling down in the studio, and he's basically telling people to run for shelter. That's 1 minute with approximate, let alone what you could do with a longer a
That's
long
right.
warning.
And the analogy to the Cascadia subduction zone is exactly the right one, in that it's offshore subduction zone earthquakes that Mexico City is worried about. Mexico City is onshore, and they have a little bit over a minute's worth of warning, as you say. In the case of the Pacific Northwest, the warning time will increase with distance up or down, but the people who are closest to the event would have less warning time. That's right.
Okay, thank you. And if we had this offshore, I mean, do we have an estimate on what an offshore? The Japanese are deploying offshore, so we must. I mean, there is a known technology. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, and it's obviously, since you have to lay a cable, it's more expensive,
That's right.
and you have to put things on the seafloor. So
It is, yeah, I do not have a cost estimate,
Yeah,
but I
okay.
can tell you. It is significantly more expensive than onshore, and it's primarily because of putting out the offshore cable. But there is no question that what that would allow us to do in terms of early warning would be significant.
well, I note that I can't remember who it is, but some major cable company is going to lay a new super fiber optic cable from Bandon to Asia. Maybe we just run a little splice off that, and I mean, maybe we should look into that and see if we can somehow get spliced into that. I guess that's it, Mr. Chairman. I just observed that this is very, very short-sighted that we won't partner. My state is ponying up a little money. We were going to lose the little bit of land-based detection we had now. It was temporary, and it was going to be moved to Alaska, and I got the state to put up, I think, $440,000 to buy the sensors in place. So states will be willing to partner, but this should be a shared responsibility to build out a robust early warning system, save lives, and save, it will save manufacturing processes. It'll potentially save, the metro system in Portland if they aren't running the light rail over the bridges when the bridges go down. There will be one bridge that survives in Portland, which happens to be the brand new light rail pedestrian bridge. It is the only one probably that will survive, and that was a substantial federal investment partnering with the state. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Carson.
Thank you. I'm curious, there was a recent article in Science magazine talking about the usage of GPS smartphones to add on to Ranking Member DeFazio's question. Assisting in detecting earthquakes, essentially. Is it feasible that this technology could be incorporated into the existing warning system? And at what point, if you could project, when will our early earthquake detection systems be compatible with cell phones and other personal devices?
So yes, the answer is yes, it is feasible that we could use the sensors in smartphones. The article that you're talking about was actually trying to use the GPS sensor in a smartphone. There are also projects, including one at Berkeley, to use the accelerometer in the cell phone. So now we're talking about using the seismometer component and the GPS positioning component. So there are multiple projects out there that are exploring this use. I lead one of them, so clearly I think that there's real value to these systems. But I think it's important to separate clearly the smartphone-based kind of systems from the Shake Alert system, demonstration system that we're running today. The Shake Alert demonstration system is using what we now call traditional geophysical networks, which are hardened, they're more robust, we know that they will work, we know that they deliver warnings. They delivered warnings in the Napa earthquake. Cell phones, I believe, will help us improve the system in the future, but that is very much a research undertaking at this stage. It is not ready to start delivering public safety alerts.
Okay, next question. Have the lessons learned from the last year's national level exercise on the Alaska earthquake scenario been compiled and publicly released? And generally, what in your mind, what is FEMA's time frame for compiling and even publicly issuing lessons learned from that exercise to ensure that plans can be improved and even tested in the next exercise?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
My understanding is the lessons learned from last year's earthquake exercise have not been fully released yet. However, we have released some summaries of some of those lessons learned just from the recent exercise last week with Southern California. There's a number of things that we're looking at is with regard to prioritization and movement of assets, operational coordination, working with private sector more closely, international support, especially when it comes to USAR and some of the legal issues there, and then some of the planning issues that we've already seen. So we haven't yet waited for the official after action to start taking action to improve on those lessons learned, and we continue to do that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Ashford and Dr. Allen, what potential is there for public-private partnerships to improve earthquake preparedness and response? And do you have any examples of successful partnership that have emerged surrounding your particular work?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Congressman. I think one example is this Cascadia Lifelines program that we've established at Oregon State University. This is where we have private companies together with state and federal agencies pooling research funds to address joint challenges that all these lifeline providers face in the face of this Cascadia event. And it's funded and directed by these partners, both in the private sector as well as the public sector.
And in the case of the earthquake early warning effort, very much to build the fully effective system is a public-private partnership. And what I mean by that is that we see the geophysical networks that are run by federal agencies, state agencies, and universities, academic institutions, providing the kernel of the alert. But it's the private sector that is going to get that alert out to everybody most effectively. And so already we have partnerships with groups, although this is a demonstration system and it's not public, there are groups who want to be participating in issuing the alerts. Companies that have cell phone apps, companies that use dedicated radios like the NOAA weather radios, for example, things like that. And so the private sector is ready. When we have a public system, when we put out these sensors, when we issue these alerts, they are ready to then take it and deliver it to everybody in a multitude of ways. And so that's really the kind of private sector part of the project.
So in that vein, could there be a public-private partnership in terms of post-earthquake damage assessment regarding the use of unmanned aerial systems? Have you looked into that at all?
Yeah, that's something that we at Oregon State University, we have several experts on unmanned aerial systems, and one of the things that we are considering is doing post-earthquake evaluation of infrastructure using those UAVs.
And they would be by private entities as opposed to, say, FEMA, for instance?
Yeah, the most recent, they could be by private entities really people would buy the UAVs to inspect their own infrastructure. So private companies like Portland General Electric, Northwest Natural Gas. I know that ODOT is also considering buying UAVs to do their own inspections. But it could be a private sector company owns the UAVs and that they're subcontract out to the agencies.
Dr. Allen, any input?
So not with UAVs, no, that's not. I focused on the early warning piece before the shaking, so that's not really something I have knowledge of.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Sirius.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing and the ranking member. I live on the East Coast and I have a stepdaughter on the West Coast, and I wanted to be here to hear this. And I heard that you had in your research 140 recommendations that you were able to determine would help. I don't think you're going to be able to implement a lot of those recommendations because I don't think there's a lot of money here for that. But I was wondering, of those 140 recommendations, which are the ones are the more reasonable and, quite frankly, less costly to implement? And the reason I say that is because although it's different, in New Jersey we got hit by Sandy. One of the things that we found out was that gas stations had gas but had no electricity to pump it. So I was wondering, a reasonable recommendation would be to require these gas stations to have a generator. I think that's, can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure. In my task force, we took those 140 recommendations and we narrowed it down to about 15 that we thought were the most important. And I'll just give you 3 examples. Our most important recommendation from our task force was for the governor to appoint a chief resilience officer or policy advisor, someone that would really take the lead on resilience efforts in the state of Oregon. That is currently in our Ways and Means Committee in the state and pending funding. I think another example is one of our recommendations is to change hazard preparedness literature to extend the recommendation on how long people should be prepared to be on their own from 72 hours to 2 weeks. Because of the geographical distribution of the damage in these subduction zone events, people should really be prepared for a couple of weeks to be ready. I think the last thing, while there is a big price tag on the retrofit of the transportation system, we are taking a 50-year horizon. And I think by starting now and taking our time, I think that is not something we're trying to do all at once, but hoping that we can gain that resilience by the time that next earthquake hits.
Anybody else want to join in? Anything? One of what can we do to ensure that states are properly developing a building codes and enforcing them? Because I see the tornado alley, and every time I see, these homes are made out of wood. I was just wondering, what can we do to enforce the states to do a better job with the building code?
The majority of states actually have a building code that they adopt voluntarily, and then local jurisdictions do it. So the vast majority have it. The issue on tornadoes is that it's a hazard that we do not design for. It's not one of those natural hazards that ASCE 7 deals with, because the return interval on a tornado hitting that house is like 100,000 years. It's just literally that act of God. So
but I was thinking in terms of where you have a school. We should really make those schools a place where the community gather if there is a catastrophe.
You can do that with schools. They've had some success in the Midwest in hardening schools and putting safe rooms, big safe rooms within schools, so that technology is available. But just the typical home or mobile home and things like that, that will never be able to survive a tornado hit.
What I'm looking for is, what can we do to, let's say, tell the state, look, you have to make these schools that are a place where a community meets when there's a catastrophe or in anticipation of one, safer.
Why don't you go ahead?
So I guess one comment that I would have to sort of both of these questions is that I think one of the real challenges we face when it comes to all natural hazards is that they don't come around very frequently. That's good news, right? But the bad news is that it's very difficult, therefore, to get people's attention when it comes to these hazards. And that's why these things don't get enforced very, very effectively sometimes. And this is actually, I think, one of the areas where the earthquake early warning effort has a potential for a significant broader impact. We would build an early warning system in order to provide warnings. But early warning has a cachet with people because they can envision, now I'm going to get a warning on my cell phone. This is something very real. And we can use that interest to then leverage broader preparedness for, in that case, the earthquake problem. So I think what we have to do is kind of look for ways to link together these various technology opportunities to also get people's interest and to encourage individuals to take responsibility, to have the 2 weeks' worth of supplies or to have a tornado shelter.
And Dr. Allen, you said that you can evacuate a school in 1.5 minutes. Yeah, I was a teacher for 10 years. I like to see that.
That was what the principal of a school.
Well, you told our principal, I like to see that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll now recognize each member for an additional 5 minutes of questions. I'll direct my question to Mr. Hooper, but then ask each of you to weigh in. And I think we're sort of scratching the surface of this question already. This subcommittee has held a hearing and hosted a roundtable discussion on the dramatic increase in disaster costs and losses. We're working to identify opportunities to drive down the costs of disasters, and particularly the burden on the American taxpayer. Mr. Hooper, I'll start with you, but then open it up to everyone. How can some of the work you are doing potentially reduce disaster costs and losses in the United States?
We are continually improving the knowledge and the design of how we deal with earthquakes and other natural hazards. The key thing there is to implement that correctly. The designers have to design the infrastructure and the buildings correctly. ASC 7, the document that everyone uses, can do that. Then we have to get it built correctly. And so there's also this side of making sure it gets constructed the way it needs to be done. But the other challenge we face, though, is the building turnover, guys, is really short. And it takes a long time, meaning every year only 0.5% or 1% of the building stock turns over, so that it'll take time to implement better design. As I mentioned in my testimony, Cascadia did not exist in our design world until 1994. That's probably less than 2 or 3% of buildings in the Pacific Northwest that have been designed using that approach and that shaking hazard in mind. So over time, we'll get better designs as the 50-year window, as mentioned earlier, will get better improvement just through that window of the length of time. And so there's a lot of different things happening, but I think time is on our side as long as we continue to implement good design and very importantly, construction practices.
So I think that in the case of earthquake early warning, the sort of cost-benefit argument of implementing a system is a very straightforward argument. Some of the examples of what you would save, I mentioned the Northridge earthquake, and we know that 50% of the injuries were caused by falling hazards. If everybody was under a sturdy table having received a warning, then we would halve the number of injuries. It's estimated that the cost of just those injuries was $2 to $3 billion. When we think about the BART train system, each of the BART trains themselves is worth $30 million. So if you just save one train, you've saved $30 million, never mind about the 1,000 passengers that might be on the system. If we talk about schools that evacuate or other buildings that evacuate, we're talking about both reducing the number of fatalities and the number of injuries. The list goes on. So in terms of the cost-benefit for an early warning system, I think it's a real slam dunk.
I'd like to add one more comment as well. I mentioned our performance goals is life safety. And we want to put, that's a major thing in the event of an earthquake, to protect the people within the building from being killed or seriously injured. To help improve what we do economically, we need to up the game. We need to shoot for enhanced performance above that level if we really want to try to reduce costs. But in doing that, that requires the building costs to go up as well for anything that gets built new, upwards to 5 or 10% more of the construction costs in a school or a high-rise or something like that. It doesn't sound like much, but sometimes that's the tipping point between a developer saying yes to a project and no to a project. But that's something we should dialogue on, because to be resilient, to be quite honest, we do need to have better performance than just the life safety that we target today.
Anyone else?
Yeah. I think that if you look at earthquake research and you look at wise use of taxpayer dollars, I'll give you a couple of examples where research has saved millions of dollars with a huge return on the investment. An example in Oregon, Oregon Department of Transportation invested in about a $2 million research program at Oregon State University, ultimately saving $500 million in a bridge retrofit program carried out in the last decade. Another example for our Cascadia Lifelines program, we are looking at innovative ways to retrofit old buildings, old masonry structures, so that we, rather than having to tear down a structure, we can retrofit it, leave it in place, and again, save millions of dollars.
Sir, I just add, codes and standards agree with, through our NEHRP program, we do a lot to establish standards to help improve the building codes across the country. There's an enormous amount of literature we provide to that is used by the construction companies. Public education to make them aware of the threats, what to do when these threats happen. Alert and warning, we talked about mitigation, whether it's building back stronger or moving individuals out of harm's way is critically important. I think some of the new authorities we got after Sandy with regard to 424 allow us to, when we build back, to go ahead and build mitigation into those projects at a higher rate than previously before to build more resiliency. So that's it.
Thank you for your answers there. Mr. Carson.
Thank you, Chairman. My final question, is there anything that Congress can do specifically to encourage the private sector to incorporate seismic measures in infrastructure repairs and replacement?
I think that one of the things we're looking at in Oregon, especially with our private utilities, is allowing them to recover the costs in their rate base, or allowing them to cover the costs not only of the risk assessment, but also their mitigation efforts. And that is some of our recommendations from our task force report, and those are things that are pending in front of the Oregon legislature. I would say that you could do the same thing for federally regulated utilities.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you for your valuable testimony. Your comments have been helpful to today's discussion. If there are no further questions, I would ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing, and unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. I would like to once again thank our witnesses for their testimony today. If no other members have anything to add, the subcommittee stands adjourned.